And hi, everybody. Welcome. We are live. Of course, I am Brian Armentrout with the Food Safety Foundation, and this means it's Friday. Now, what's interesting is we're an hour later than we normally broadcast, but that's for a very, very good reason. And that's because we're able then to bring Charles Breen on board for our conversation today. And I'm really excited today. Welcome, Charles. Really glad to have you here.
Glad to be here, Brian, and thanks for accommodating me.
Oh, you bet. No problem. I mean, yeah, you're on the West Coast, so it's always hard trying to find that right time for the East Coast guys and the West Coast. And what you'll find with this too is we have people that listen to this live stream from all over the world. So it's definitely a time constrained thing. But what's nice about this is because it's recorded, people can watch it later and things like that too. So I'm in Loveland, Colorado, where it's been amazingly hot. The last couple of days, record heat here. It was over 100 degrees. How's the weather up in Washington?
Much less stressful.
And actually, what's the temperature been up there?
It was 80 yesterday, but it's only going to be 72 today.
Nice. And actually, I got home last night. My wife was actually a little miffed at me because I was out visiting a client, and the weather was absolutely gorgeous. And so I would text her back, and she wasn't too pleased with me. So that's always interesting. So one of the things we like to do here at the beginning of the live stream, of course, we are on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, simulcasting, is everybody pop in and say hello and tell us where you're from. And as I had mentioned before, I'm in beautiful Loveland, Colorado, which is not the ski resort. There's actually a Loveland ski resort. And then there's a city of Loveland, which is by Fort Collins, kind of the north side of Colorado State and things like that. So not a bad place to be. Good news is the weather's looking better here today. So that's all well. So please, everybody, type in. Once again, with this, even though we have an amazing expert here who's going to give us a perspective from FDA, we'll get into that in a bit. This is a conversation. This is not a presentation. This is not a bunch of PowerPoint slides. This is two people talking about issues that are of interest to people in the food safety community. So the more involved you are in the conversation, the better it's going to be. So please let us know your questions. We'll get to them as they fit into the conversation, and we'll take it from there. So one of the things, and that looks like a wonderful idea, Charles. One of the things that we like to do here in the live stream at the beginning is have everyone lift their cup and their preferred beverage. So I have coffee. It looks like you got coffee there too, Charles.
Yep.
So everybody, please join us with a sip of your favorite beverage, and let's all enjoy. So hoist your cup with us, please. Such a great way to start the day. I like that. Now, if you're in other parts of the world, who knows what you're drinking at this particular hour. So, Charles, your background is really, really impressive. Why don't you kind of walk everybody through here who doesn't know who you are, kind of your background and what you're up to now.
Okay, thank you. I started with FDA as an investigator in San Francisco, approximately when the Earth's crust was still cooling. And I was later the resident investigator in Helena, Montana, a wonderful place to live and work. I was a compliance officer at the Center for Veterinary Medicine for 5 years. The branch director in St. Louis when it was a branch. And I was then selected for being the Seattle district director in 2000. I retired in 2013. I took a break before starting work again, 2 whole weeks, and contacted EAS and have been working independently and with EAS since the fall of 2013.
Nice. Yeah. EAS Consulting for anybody. And so Charles' email address is on the screen as well. EAS is a consulting group with an amazing variety of expertise like Charles that you can call upon. I work with EAS as well. Just an amazing team over there. So definitely, if you have any questions or there's things that pique your interest in this conversation today, reach out to me, reach out to Charles. That's what we're here for. So pretty much for people who don't necessarily understand the hierarchy of how things are set up in FDA. So when your career was in Washington, kind of walk us through what you would do then as what was the title again? District director, right?
Yes, it was.
Yes. Yeah.
please understand things have changed since I retired.
Oh yeah.
When I was working, Seattle District still had the entire range of FDA commodities. Um, Investigators were specialized, of course, but it was all under the same district umbrella for a management structure.
Mhm.
What FDA has done now is specialize the management of commodity based teams, not only in headquarters, but through the field.
Mhm.
So, whereas I directed investigators who could do multiple work in multiple commodity areas, the current structure is, um, well, stovepiped has a negative connotation, but it shouldn't in this case.
Yeah.
It is, there are people who are specializing in food or medical devices. And if they report to the local management structure, that's fine. But if they're reporting to another management structure, for instance, in Seattle, the medical device people report to their program director in Los Angeles.
Hmm.
Um, Functionally, it's a little bit different. There's less surge capacity. You can't move people from one side to another,
Hmm.
but it also provides for a greater degree of specialization and expertise within a given commodity area.
Oh, absolutely. So so if you're a expert at FDA, if you're an investigator with an expertise in food, so in the past, the model may have been you would be going in and visiting food plants, but you were also visiting other types of industries where you may not know as much about. So everything got reshuffled, and food people then would stick to food. And I definitely saw that in my career in food. And so we would have FDA investigators come into one of our plants, and he was a really strong expert in medical device. And he understood that really, really well. And so sometimes there was miscommunication between how he was looking at things and how we were looking at things. And so from my perspective as coming from industry, I liked that this restructuring took place.
Yes, it does mean, like I said, little surge capacity between commodity areas,
Mhm.
but it also makes it more explicit for resource allocation.
Oh.
Here's a program that doesn't have enough staff to accomplish its responsibilities.
Right. Yeah.
It,
And
it
well,
no longer gets disguised.
well, that's true. Yeah, because it's harder to kind of shuffle people around and be like, hey Joe, I need you to go and perform a visit at this facility. Well, I don't know anything about that. Well, I need you to do that. Now I don't think it would be that far out of a thing, but you kind of get the drift. So the resource allocation piece of it, that to me is fascinating. So over the course of a month or a quarter or whatever, I would imagine you would sit down and figure out, okay, here's the things I need to do. I have people that I need to go and visit for cause, meaning that, okay, we've had an issue in the field. We've had reports of illness. I need to send an investigator into this place. There's other facilities that are high risk that you need to say, okay, I got guys that I need to go see these guys, make sure they're doing a good job. And then there's kind of other ones that you're not necessarily as worried about. So you only have so much resources you have to allocate. And so you got to kind of move those things around. From an industrial standpoint, it's very similar to supplier audits. In a given quarter, I could only visit so many suppliers to see how they're doing. So I would pick and choose the ones that I was most worried about. Is that a good description?
It's less mechanical.
Okay.
But yes, the overall description is okay. It starts with priority. What is the area that needs the most attention? And just talking about routine now.
Mhm.
The work plan is prepared every year. Within foods, where I did most of my work for the past or the last few years I was with FDA, the Center for Foods would actually list here are the establishments within your area that you can pick and choose from. They would give us a list that might be 10 or 15% larger than what the work plan called for.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the year, if 50 to 60% of them were actually accomplished, that was a good year. Because this is routine work. The unplanned work, the illnesses, the outbreaks, things like that would throw the routine work to the side.
Yeah.
And everybody would be working on the high priority work.
Yeah. So there's a big outbreak that happens in produce or something that all of a sudden you're like, oh, all right, I gotta go take care of this. Everything else, drop it.
Mm-hmm. Or the most stark example was in December of 2003 when USDA identified a cow with BSE
Ooh.
in eastern Washington.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, most people do remember that, but we lived it.
Oh, geez. I can only imagine. So pretty much it was, yeah, drop everything and go figure out
Yes.
what the heck is going on because, oh,
Yes, and even before we knew what was going on, we didn't know where it was at first.
mhm.
But the director of investigations, Celeste Corcoran, who was and is outstanding,
Uh-huh.
uh, was sent people east. Go across the mountains, and we'll tell you where to go after you get there.
Oh, wow. Crazy.
Finally, USDA talked to us, and the things went much more smoothly.
Uh-huh. So I can, yeah, I mean, so it's kind of like on the industrial side when you manage a crisis situation and you have a recall. I mean, I would imagine at that time, the press was wanting information, politicians are demanding to know what's going on so then they can let their constituents know. There's concerned consumers who are like, oh my God, do I stop eating meat? What do I do? Wow, that would have been a lot to manage.
Fortunately, we didn't get many consumer calls, but
Hmm.
press, other industry, attorneys for other industry, and the occasional political, but not too much. Mostly they went to headquarters because they figured that's where they had clout.
Mhm. Well, that makes sense. I could see where like trade associations and stuff like that, cattlemen's groups and things like that, right? They're calling their senators trying to figure out what's going on. Wow, interesting. So welcome, Wilco from the Netherlands. We have Nilesh from India. Welcome. Glad to have you guys here. Really appreciate it. So one of the things, Charles, as a person, right? So I spent my career in industry managing quality at companies, is FDA shows up. And that mechanism then of there's the inspection and you may or may not get a 483 and all these type of things. Can you kind of walk us through kind of behind the curtains of the mechanics of how all of that works? And sometimes it seems like one place will get written up for something and somebody who may have got written for something up in another area doesn't. How does that kind of work?
Yeah, well, an inspection gets made. Let's say there's some things that need to be corrected. A 483 is issued. The firm has an opportunity to respond to that 483, usually 15 working days before FDA will consider doing anything more. And since between 30 and 33% of all inspections result in a 483, every one of them, almost every one of them, is in violation of one piece or another of the Food and Drug Act.
Mm-hmm.
But the number of times it progresses to a regulatory action, starting even with a warning letter, is a tiny fraction of that. So there is a lot of judgment that goes into the fact set that an investigator has determined to be the case at a facility.
Mm-hmm.
And I know of one example, this is after I retired, where two nearby firms, they were within a half a mile of each other, were drawing their raw materials from the same area. They had the same pathogen turn up in their products. They were making quite similar products.
Mm-hmm.
One firm got a warning letter, the other firm did not. So what was the difference? It was primarily that the firm that did not get a warning letter was much more aggressive about stopping any operation that would continue to put consumers at risk,
Uh-huh.
and to commit to not resuming operations until they knew that what they had was under control.
Uh-huh.
And in fact, it took almost 2 years for them to be satisfied that they had things well under control, that the pathogen wasn't going to be affecting their product. The firm that got the warning letter didn't really know how to address the problem. They said, well, we'll clean up and resume operations because we've got all this stuff that we need to process before the crop year's over. FDA did not take kindly to that because it meant that consumers would still be at risk from these products that they were trying to push out the door.
Yeah. Well, and that message, Charles, essentially what they're telling FDA was, well, we understand this food safety thing, but operations is much more important, right? Essentially, that was what they were saying.
Yeah, that was the bottom line.
Oh.
That bothers FDA.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's an important point. And when you bring this back up to the 30,000 foot level, Charles, everybody working at FDA, it's people, right? Just like everybody else in industry and everything else, trying to work through these things. And when you have an audit in a facility, let's say, a GFSI audit or something like this, and SQF comes in, that auditor is looking to see if there's a match between what you're saying and what you're doing, right? And it's the same with FDA. And one of the things that I hammer home on these live streams is the basics are always the best place to start. And one of the things that I like to beat on is plan, do, check, act, right? Everything should be set up that way. FDA doesn't expect perfection. And the example I use in this would be environmental monitoring, right? You have a program, you're aggressively looking for things in the environment that could potentially get into the product. And when you find things, you're taking corrective actions to fix it, right? You're always closing that loop. And I think that's in your story, I think that illustrates that really well, in that one firm took seriously what FDA found and said, hey, listen, guys, you got a problem. And they're like, you're absolutely right. Here's the steps we're going to take to fix that, right? We want to work with you. We want to give transparency around this process and get to the end goal because we're on the same page, right? And your response back as the person managing this entire process is, okay, good. This is a player who understands their responsibilities and wants to work with us. That's a good thing.
Yes. In fact, the company that did it right was new in the business. They had just recently bought the facility. They were not expert in food manufacturing. They knew manufacturing, but food was new to them. And so they hired a former FDA chief counsel to advise them, and they followed his advice. Now, the hiring of the chief counsel is routine, but following the advice, that's where it was key.
Yep, most definitely. One of the things that we always did, and it's one of the things that I recommend for my clients as well, is on the crisis management side of things, in every district, there is a person who manages recalls. Those names and contact information are listed with FDA. Get to know who that person is, right? The time, it's not when the crisis happens. You need to reach out to those guys and say, hi, my name's Brian. I'm managing quality for this company. Just wanted to let you know that we're doing these type of things at the facility, and we welcome FDA's input and help, right? It's back to that people point, Charles, in that both sides are people, and people that are easier to talk with. I was out at a client this week, and I'm helping them put their programs in place for GFSI and their food safety programs, and they're doing a great job. And that was one of the points that I made with them is I advised them that they need to secure the services of a good food safety counsel now, right? You don't want to build that relationship if something happens. That's too late, right? You need to be able to pick up the phone and who you're talking with, and you trust them, right? It's the same with FDA. You need to build those bridges.
Yes, and within the legal profession, there are areas of expertise. You don't want a tax attorney advising you about a food recall.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, because I think that's something that companies forget, is your in-house counsel is focused on other stuff, and their expertise is in other areas. They're looking at mergers and acquisitions, contract law, human resources. They're not food safety lawyers. That is a very, very specific discipline.
It is. And as I was mentioning earlier about the division of responsibilities into commodity areas, the recall coordinator for one commodity might not be in what was once a district office closest to you. For instance, I know that the food recalls out of Chicago are handled from somebody out of Detroit. But it's all listed on the FDA website. You can find out who covers what commodity area, where your facility is located, and it'll say who you should call. And even if you don't call them up and say, hi, here I am, at least make a note of the phone number and the email address so that when something occurs, you don't have to spend time looking it up again.
Yeah, that's a good point. You don't necessarily want to, I hate to use the term waste their time, but you don't want to unnecessarily put burdens upon them, right? Because if you're the recall crisis coordinator, you got a lot going on.
Yeah. When the atmospheric impeller turns brown, you don't want to have to spend any more time doing routine stuff than you have to. And knowing where to call first is the best way to go.
Absolutely. So that's very interesting. So part of So FSMA obviously has changed the world dramatically relative to how companies are managing things and how FDA is now responding to things. And part of what we do at the Food Safety Foundation, and part of what I look at in my consulting business, is case studies. Industry, so to your earlier example, Charles, things that we have players who did a great job responding, right, which we need to model. But conversely, those ones who didn't do a good job responding, those can teach us some things too. And the example I've been watching really closely here recently is Real Water down in Nevada. Have you been following that one too?
A little bit.
Yeah.
I've read the news reports.
Yeah, there are a ton. I mean, you can go to YouTube. I've been compiling these in my membership site. There's at least 20 local and national stories of interviews with victims and lawyers and like Inside Edition and CBS News and these type of things talking about this Real Water case. So for people who don't know, Real Water is a alkalized water that I'll say was because they're shut down now, in Nevada, and they were distributed in the West. Pretty successful. So they were adding something to the water, and it's not really clear what at this point, that was, jacking up the pH. And it looks like, and this is something I'm going to be curious for your take on, because on the industry side, we have to kind of piece this together as outsiders and figure out what's going on. So it appears from what I've seen so far, and this is just my opinion, that based upon an employee interview, right, they actually had a former employee who was making this batch interviewed on camera with a news agency, testifying, it wasn't court, right, but he was giving his impression of, yeah, I add this stuff to these batches of water. I don't know what it is. They just tell me to add it. And I went to go do the test, which I assume was a pH test, and it wasn't right. And so my boss just told me to add a bunch more. So I added a bunch more. So then this resulted in something that we normally don't hear about, right? Which is with the liver, right? We hear about hepatitis and things like this, which we always assume is viral or things like this. But really that applies to a broader category of things which the liver can be impacted. And a lot of people got really sick really fast. And I think there were like 5 children. They couldn't treat them in the area where this happened in Nevada. They had to air flight these kids out to Salt Lake City. They were talking liver transplants, but luckily they were able to nurse these kids back to health. And thank goodness none of that happened. But the response back from the company is what I find most interesting. And FDA had to really ratchet up their response quickly, moving to injunctions against the company to stop them from manufacturing product. Because FDA essentially, the conversation as I can piece together was, hey, you guys need to shut down and stop selling product. Okay, we'll do that. Hey, you're still selling product. Oh, are we? Oh, sorry about that, right? And so FDA got fed up really quickly and took very aggressive action. So that's kind of my viewpoint from an industry standpoint. As an outsider, but tons of FDA experience, how does that kind of filter through your view?
Well, when I worked for FDA, there were, in my mind, 3 kinds of firms out there. There were the ones who wanted to do it right and mostly succeeded. And when they slipped, they fixed. There was a small portion of firms that wanted to do it right, but were incompetent.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an even smaller portion of the firms who didn't care about doing it right and didn't want to be told by anybody, here's how to do it. Mm-hmm. Those were the ones for whom FDA attention was directed the most, the last 2 categories. Mm-hmm. The ones who couldn't do it right and the ones who wouldn't do it right.
Oh, and so did those tend to be like smaller operations, newer manufacturers, like we were talking about earlier, so people who were new to food? Was there any pattern?
There were some smaller firms, yes. There were also some large firms. Recently, by this I mean a couple of years ago, do you recall the major recall of a breakfast cereal because of salmonella?
Yes.
Okay. The company that was selling it, the brand name company, had a contract manufacturer for that product. Mm-hmm. And the contract manufacturer had an environmental sampling program, monitoring program within their firm. And they were detecting positives for salmonella. Mm-hmm. And it was like, oh, okay, moving on. Seriously,
Okay, yeah, interesting.
they did nothing to prevent the salmonella from moving from wherever they found it to the product, and it did get in the product, and there was a huge recall. Um, they were the first recipient of an FDA warning letter based upon FSMA charges,
Mm,
and it's the only warning letter that I've read. Maybe not the only one that exists, but the only one that I've read that actually criticized the existence of the food safety plan for not being adequate.
mm,
FDA doesn't usually call a plan inadequate,
mm.
um, but in this case, it really was. They they didn't follow up on any kind of corrective action, and I don't know if this company is still making the product, but I do know it's a very large multinational that um, was really surprised. I know of a very large pet food manufacturer that was surprised with a warning letter.
Mhm.
What they had done was get a premix from another firm that inadvertently had included, I don't know, some 9 to 10 times the level of vitamin D. I think it was D. It was
Mhm.
a fat soluble vitamin, the kind that accumulates and when overdosed can cause problems. The plan they had for supplier control was they would check the content of the ingredients in their premix. Well, they didn't check the vitamin because it's such an expensive and difficult um, analysis to perform.
Right.
So, in this case, the manufacturer of the finished product got a warning letter instead of the manufacturer of the premix.
Mm,
Whereas in the cereal, it was the other way around. The contract manufacturer that was making the finished product for the brand name seller got the warning letter instead of the brand name seller. So it's not a one-to-one comparison, but the pet food manufacturer was shocked. They thought they were doing it right. They thought they
uh-huh.
were doing what they were supposed to. And they were in very nearly all instances except this one.
Mm,
And um, I would assess their probability of getting a warning letter in the future as almost nil.
right.
They got the message.
Good.
They know what FDA expects. When you say you're going to check something in your food safety plan, you had better be checking it.
Mhm. Yeah. And that's it seems from my career, as I look back as from the manufacturing side, companies really kind of break down into two areas when it comes to food safety at the leadership level. And the first one always makes me worried, and I'll jump on this right away when I see it, is if I essentially get the response back, Charles, along the lines of, well, we've never had a problem before, right? And that makes me just go, ooh, okay, so what you're telling me is that past luck equals future success. Well, that's a dangerous model. Are you sure about that? The other group then is the ones who have had something happen and their eyes are opened, and they realize, holy moly, we didn't realize that this was going on. All right, now we understand, right? And
Yes,
it's sad that has to happen sometimes.
yes. And you named what I think is the key point there. The top management understands.
Yes.
Um, I have been in some huge multinational firms where the top management does get it, and others where they delegate it out to the plant managers. Say, this is your job, you take care of it.
And that, yeah, I always, every chance I get when I was in industry, when could sit down with the CEO and explain to them the park doctrine and why they can't do that, right? That would always open eyes, right? Because it was essentially the view, Charles. You summarized it very well. That's not my problem. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It absolutely 100% is. When that warning letter goes out, it's your name on that warning letter, not the operations manager.
Yes. And you mentioned the park doctrine.
Yeah.
For those who aren't familiar, it means that you don't have to know that something is going wrong in order to be held criminally responsible because it went wrong.
Right.
And did you read recently that Jack DeCoster's appeal to the Supreme Court was turned down?
Was it? I hadn't saw that yet.
Right. DeCoster was probably the most recently convicted person under the Food and Drug Act for failure to protect food safety. One of the bases for his appeal that he tried to take to the Supreme Court was, I didn't know what was going on. So it wasn't my fault that things went bad.
Mhm.
But instead of taking the case up and potentially overturning Park and earlier than that Dotterwake, the court decided we don't even rule. This is settled law. Jack, you stay in jail.
Mhm. Good. That's what I say. Good.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, and it's something that when you read through, and this for people who don't know, you can actually get some, not all, you can get some of the materials that FDA uses for doing their job. So, for example, the Investigation Operations Manual, and you can follow through that and get an understanding of how FDA is doing things. And this is kind of, if you're an investigator in the field, this is what they want you to do. And as we kind of move around in our conversation, a lot of things tie into that. And the observation I wanted to make with that in relation to the Park Doctrine is all of this process of the investigator coming in, looking at your processes, doing a GMP audit versus a food safety audit, all of these type of things are all part of investigation and evidence gathering, right? So they are trained that the information that they're gathering is done in such a way that if it progresses to this level of severity, that information is going to be allowed in court.
Yeah, but also recall that evidence is collected to show where a firm is doing things right. So if inspected, you shouldn't be intimidated because an investigator is getting into detailed information. If you're doing it right, it's going to go into the file as they're doing it right.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good point too. Everybody has a file, right? So
yes.
as an investigator is going out and visiting facilities and they're taking their notes and preparing their reports and these type of things, and that information comes back to you, there's a file that's built on that. And as the next investigator through the next cycle of visits comes up, they look through that information, don't they?
Yes. Mm-hmm. It's part of the routine operations that you can read in the investigator's operation manual if you choose to delve into it.
Yeah. Oh, good morning, Nathan, by the way. I didn't see you there, my friend. Always good to have you here. So I've been reading through, so there's a brand new manual out, 2021, and I've been going through that. And don't know if you've been digging into this yet, Charles, but I've been going through the environmental monitoring piece in the manual. Have you looked at that yet?
No, I haven't.
What's very interesting, and I'd be very curious to get your take on this, is essentially in industry for environmental monitoring, our program has been based on, you look at where Listeria or Salmonella in the environment comes from. So your sampling plan is heavy on drains and floors and things that are surrounding food contact areas, in the theory that if there's contamination in those areas, it's going to move toward those areas and you'll be able to identify those as they magnify in those areas. Pretty much you never sampled food contact areas, things of this nature. Reading through the manual, that's not FDA's approach. FDA's approach when they're going in and doing sampling is the reverse, right? So they're looking at, and this is simplified, right? There's more than this, of course, but I want to get your take on it. So for Listeria, they're looking at zone 1, so direct food contact surfaces, and zone 2 if they're close. So an example is, let's say you have a cooling tunnel and there's condensate on the top of the cooling tunnel, right? They would sample that as a zone 2. They may look at some 3, but they're pretty much going to ignore zone 4. And for Salmonella, they're going to look at, and of course this depends on the product, dry environment, wet environment, all these things. They're going to be looking at 2 and 3 and focusing on those areas when they're getting their sampling plan together. And as you had referenced before with the Center for Food Science and Applied Nutrition, CFSAN, that's the group that's saying, okay, as you're going into this type of facility, here's the type of stuff you should be looking for, right? And they're really targeting in on those type of things. So as I've been working with my clients and working on environmental programs, that's what I've been telling them to do, right? So a huge switch. And I don't think industry realizes yet just how big a change that is.
The environmental sampling monitoring that's called for under the Food Safety Modernization Act doesn't really say what zones to sample.
Right.
And I think part of that is because FDA recognizes the potential liability if it said you will sample zone 1 and a positive turns up.
Yeah.
If you're using an indicator organism, the positive might or might not really mean there's a pathogen there.
Right.
But if you do determine there's a pathogen there, now you have a problem
Hmm.
in that there's all this food stuff that needs to be evaluated. Excuse me. Um, However, given that it doesn't require a manufacturer to sample in zone 1, most of the firms that I've been looking at lately do sample in zone 1.
Yeah. Good.
And I guess I've been hitting a bunch of good firms in a row. They haven't been finding any positives in zone 1,
Hmm.
but they have been finding positives in zones 2, 3, and 4, not many in 2. And I believe that FDA considers this to be a good sign in that they're looking in the places where it might show up, as opposed to making sure they never find it by looking in places where it won't show up.
You hit the nail on the head, Charles, right? In industry, and I was guilty of this too, right? I'm kicking my own butt here. Is it was hear no evil, see no evil, know no evil, right? It's like, okay, our environmental sampling program is great, everything is fine, and we're just doing this to make sure that we're covered, and that's not the purpose. That is not the purpose, right?
Right.
And so part of this, right, and you hit on an important point here too, is FDA will not direct a company when you're doing zone 1 sampling, right? So direct food contact sampling surfaces to hold product. But man, my clients do, right? So as we're putting programs together, we're going to bookend that product, right? So sanitation to sanitation. We're going to sample zone 1. All of that product goes on hold until we get the negative results back, and then we release.
Yes.
And that's the right way to do it.
Yes.
If you release it, you're taking a big risk.
Yes, and also the right way to sample is after it's been in production for a number of hours.
Yes, and in the investigations operations manual, they're suggesting, and of course this always depends on circumstances, at least 4 hours into production. It doesn't do you any good to sample clean and sanitized equipment.
No, it doesn't.
No.
You can sample for biological residue, which will help give you an evaluation of how good the sampling was,
Right.
the cleaning was. But no, niche environments are, well, they're pretty much tightened up after cleaning and sanitation. And it takes a while for production to loosen up the biofilm to break off and contaminate a product.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, because things like Listeria and stuff like that's those type of bacteria. That's what they do, right? They set up an environment. They're like, okay, this is a nice home now. I think we'll hang out here for a while, right? And if you're not stripping that off, it's there, and you don't even know it's there. So one of the things I'd be curious to get FDA's perspective on this through your eyes is that when a potential issue happens and FDA comes in to take a look at it, one of the things that from my perspective they look at very closely, as I referenced here just a little bit ago, was those bookends, right? Are you truly segregating your product like you think you are? What about rework? What are you guys bringing over from the prior day? And a lot of times my theory is that when you see there's a recall, and FDA goes in to do an investigation to see what the heck is going on, and then a week or two later you see that recall has expanded. My theory has always been that FDA went in then and found that those end pieces and that segregation that company thought they had weren't very robust when FDA started looking at them.
Yes, that's usually the case. But there have been instances where industry itself has said, here's what we thought, but our continued investigation has shown that we were too narrow. So they will take it to FDA to say, we need to expand the recall. It's not always FDA finding and expanding a recall. There are industry members who also have a, oh my God kind of moment and will do the right thing.
Good. Oh, hey, everybody, by the way, while we're kind of talking here, this is a absolutely amazing opportunity to ask Charles questions. So if you have a question for him, please put it in the comments here and we'll tackle that. So as we're like we talked about before this call here, Charles, it's amazing how quickly these calls go, right? We're already almost at the 39-minute mark. One of the controversial topics that FDA and industry tend to fight over a lot is photography. And my position as a head of quality within companies is to always have very strong, robust, no photography policies in my facilities. And if FDA comes in and wants to take pictures, I push back really, really hard. What's your position and what are your comments and opinions relative to that from FDA's perspective? through your opinion?
Somewhat less rigid.
Uh,
Photography can also show you're doing a good job.
hmm?
But if you're doing a good job, FDA doesn't need to take photographs to demonstrate that.
Ah,
And if you're not, then yes, they will want to take photographs. The case law that FDA is relying on is not food and drug law,
mm,
but an instance of OSHA using an aerial photography over a pollution emitting plant, and the facility complained in court saying this was illegally obtained evidence.
mhm,
And the court ruled no, taking photographs is part of OSHA's responsibility to document emission of pollution. So FDA has decided that their position is this precedent allows FDA to take photographs within a facility.
mm,
But when refused, the response is, are you sure you want to refuse this? Maybe our lawyers should talk to your lawyers.
right,
Sometimes firms will then allow photographs, sometimes not.
right.
Some firms will take photographs alongside FDA. Other firms just won't allow it at all. What I haven't seen, and what FDA hasn't seen, is a test case where the conditions and practices within a facility are leading to demonstrable harm
Mm,
that cannot be adequately documented and shown to exist without photographs. So usually if there's a facility that has problems,
uh-huh.
it'll show up in the products.
Oh.
And if there are no problems in the products, then whatever's going on in the facility that looks so awful maybe isn't that much of a health risk.
Hmm.
When such a case arises that it can't show it without a photograph and it is a health risk,
Uh-huh.
that's when FDA will probably take a test case.
And, hmm,
There have been some instances where FDA has obtained warrants to take photographs.
oh,
So far, none of them have been adjudicated, appealed and adjudicated, that would then give FDA a precedent to say, yes, we can take photographs.
huh. I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, my memory may be wrong, but this goes back quite a while, that FDA was pressing on this, and that two large food companies in the US, one multinational, said, okay, fine, if you want to pursue this, we're going to take you to court on this and settle this. And then that never happened.
Probably because FDA thought about it and said, well, there's not enough of a health risk here. We would probably lose.
Got it. And then that's
And that's the kind of thinking that also goes into some of the decision making as to whether or not to pursue a regulatory action against a firm. Is there enough of a health hazard to justify to a court that it's more than just a technical violation of the act, that it is really important that whatever's happening be stopped?
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense, right? And again, this links back to the beginning of our conversation, right? So as the head in this particular area, these are the type of decisions you had to make, essentially weighing the different factors of how you wanted to move forward. Because once you're moving from the base activities of inspecting and regulating and issuing not warrants, but issuing 43s and things like this. And then moving from that into the legal side of things where, okay, well, we have here adulteration. We have misbranded products, right? We have violations of law that need to be prosecuted. That's a different game, right? So then these things become tools for building that case.
Yes, they do.
Interesting. So as a takeaway from that, then from industry, if I'm in a production facility and the FDA comes in and set up and things like this, and the investigation starts, and all of a sudden the investigator wants to start taking photographs and becomes quite adamant about it, I know there's probably something that's not right.
Yeah. Although I do know one investigator who was a very good investigator who took photographs in lieu of taking many notes because it was easier for him to write his report. So there are non-punitive plans for, sometimes the taking the photographs.
Right. Well, I think too, I mean, a good way to kind of loop back on this as well. Oh, by the way, Brian, great to see you, our friend Brian. A good way to look at this and a good phrase to use, and I think this applies to industry and FDA as well, is pick your battles, right? You need to look at these things in the context of what you're doing. And is this the hill you want to die on? Is it that important? And that's why you need to have, on the manufacturing side of things, a good internal team, good legal representation who understands food law, so you can work through these issues and decide what the correct course of action is. So to your point, Charles, it may be that, okay, yeah, we are going to allow photographs in this particular case because it's in our benefit to cooperate with FDA in this particular instance. This isn't necessarily negating our right to refuse these type of activities in the future, but we need to figure this out. And I think a big piece of this too then goes back to what we referenced earlier with the file, right?
Yes, it does.
If you're a hyper-aggressive food production facility who fights FDA the entire way, FDA are people, right? And they take note of that, right? So if you're going to take that position, that may not be the right way to go, right? This is a give and take, and it's
but it's not personal. That's why the investigator isn't the deciding individual as to whether or not an action takes place.
Yeah.
It is removed from the investigator. It goes first to a supervisor, and if further to a compliance officer, and usually to a compliance center, in headquarters, where all of this guy is a real jerk aspects are filtered out.
Yeah.
They're not relevant to the decision. Is there a health hazard? Is there something that is harming or could harm consumers that needs to be addressed?
That's a great clarification.
There are facilities that I was inspecting when I was an investigator where the guy was just a complete jackass. But the food products were okay. And so that was the end of it.
No, I mean, it's golden rule type thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recommend not being a jackass, but if you're doing stuff right, well, you're still a jackass.
Well, and it's a good point, because how long ago did that happen?
I was an investigator a long time ago.
Right, and you still remember that?
Oh yeah.
Right. If you treat people badly, they remember it a long time.
Yep.
So don't do that. Please don't do that. Fascinating conversation, Charles. If people have additional questions and information, can they reach out to you at this email address and kind of fire it for you? Excellent.
Certainly.
Love it. I really appreciate you. And man, thank you for being here. This has been great. Being able to pull back the curtain like this only benefits both sides, right? The more we understand where each side is coming from, the better it's going to be. I
just saw one typo in the address. There's no period. It's just C. Breen.
Oh, C. Breen. Sorry about that. So that is C. Breen at easconsultinggroup.com. So let's put it over here in the comments too, so that everybody has that. All right, let's make sure I got it right this time. C. Breen, no period, at easconsultinggroup.com. Correct?
Yes.
All right. There we go.
Oh, I see a question from Tom Sidebottom.
Yes.
Hello, Tom. Do you think FDA is prepared to handle the emerging food technology like in cell-based meat products? If not, what does FDA need to do?
That's a great question.
I think FDA isn't ready today. I think FDA isn't going to be regulating cell-based food products until, one, it feels it is ready to regulate, and two, it has managed to convince USDA to back off a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the good news on this is I have a client who's working in this very field, and they are working really, really closely with FDA to explain how this works, how the process is manufactured, what the end product is. So they're doing the right thing, right? They're explaining this so it understands. And you got to figure from a food safety standpoint, it's probably safer, right? As far as pathogen growth and things like that. Yeah,
but public perception is still going to suffer from the mistakes Monsanto made with the flavor saver tomato.
Good point.
Where they marketed it to producers. Hey, this is great for you guys to make tomatoes that don't spoil. And it allowed for those who were hesitant about the technology to enter the entire space of, hey, consumer, you don't know what's in this, you need to worry. So that's a perception that will have to be overcome.
Absolutely.
A measure of that might be the success or non-success of the Aqua Bounty farmed, genetically modified salmon.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then, yeah, I mean, yeah, you have different groups out there who have different agendas and different things that they want to do right, throwing labels on like Frankenfood and all those type of things. So those things will always continue. It's an interesting world we live in, isn't it?
Yep.
For sure. Well, but I mean, so we're up to 50 minutes. Like I said, Charles, it's amazing how quick these calls go. And I've really, really enjoyed this. Thank you for being here. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Glad to, Brian.
Yep. All right. Well, so everybody, please join us next week. We'll be at 8 a.m. Mountain Time next week on Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern, and early at 7 a.m. on the Pacific Coast for our early risers out there. And we'll tackle our next food safety topic. And again, please, my email is here. If you have something you would like me to talk about and bring in a guest and get additional information like experts like Charles, please let me know. Drop me a line and I'll track those guys down and we'll bring them on and get you educated on these topics, right? Because with food safety, the more everybody knows, the better off we are, because food safety is not a point of competition. We're all in the same boat for this, so we have to help each other out. So with that, everybody,
still eating.
Yeah. So everybody have a fantastic weekend. It's going to be a little cooler in here in Colorado. Get out and enjoy yourselves, and we'll see you here next week. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Charles. Bye, everyone.